The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's HUG Education Series webinar, Campus Solutions, HCM Instance Separation Part 2, Deep Dive into Utilities. My name is Carol Newell. I am with the HUG Education Series, and I would like to welcome you and thank you for attending. Before we start, just a few housekeeping notes. You are all on mute, so you can hear our speaker today without any background noise. Due to the number of people in attendance, we will take questions at the end of the presentation. If you have a question, please ask your question in the question box found in your GoToMeeting dashboard. We'll be able to get the questions easily from there. Tomorrow we will have a recording and slides of today's presentation available on HUG Online for you to access. Today's webinar will be presented by Michael Kennedy, a regular contributor to the HUG's TAG Split Focus Group. Mike Kennedy is a Senior Solutions Architect and Consultant for Cedar Crestone with more than 14 years experience designing, developing, deploying, and maintaining commercial software products. He also has more than 8 years of software consulting experience. Prior to joining Cedar Crestone, Mr. Kennedy was the Director of Architecture for the Education and Research Industries at Oracle PeopleSoft. During this period, he focused on the Campus Solutions Student Administration product suite, where he was a senior member of the product management team from the initial release through PeopleSoft 9.0 and the rolling release model. In addition, he was a senior member of the HRMS architecture team during the person model refactoring and was the lead architect of the popular and successful enterprise learning management product. Mike was a major contributor to the ongoing Campus Solutions HCM instance separation efforts at Oracle. In 2011, Mike led the split project for Cedar Crestone at Palmer College, Oracle's first early adapter program customer to go live. He has since led similar split-related projects at over 20 institutions, 16 of which are now live. Thank you for joining us today, Mike. The floor is all yours.
Hi, thank you. First of all, can you see my screen okay?
You can.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for the introduction. This is the second webinar in a two-part series, and in the first one we focused on some of the project activities and challenges around the split, planning your project, implementing the split, and then after you go live. And today's webinar is focusing on our Cedar Crestone utilities that we built, working with, actually now it's more than 30 customers where we've installed the utilities, and we have at least 17 live now as of last weekend. We had one more go live that went real well, I'm happy to announce. So we're going to focus on the utilities. If you missed the last webinar, it's definitely available on the HUG site, and we can get you that information. Oops, let me see here. This is not, there we go. Okay, so what we did at Cedar is in the beginning, we realized that a lot of schools were going to have a real similar set of activities to perform when they went through a split project. And we, at Palomar, we started this effort and we've continued it, and I'm working on the utilities. They're pretty done now and baked, but even as recently as the last few weeks, we've put finishing polishes on these utilities that have evolved. And I'm going to walk you through them. Whether or not you use us, there's ideas in here and approaches that I think you can make use of. Our goal has been, and I think this has definitely been the case, is that they've made the projects go a lot quicker and be a lot more safe, and they lower risk. And I'll explain how that is. So the utilities break into several different categories. The first is data ownership management. I'll talk about that a little bit in detail. That's what helps us set the ownership of each table after the split. What's the situation going to be? Is it going to be in HR only? Is it going to be in campus only? Is it going to be in both? And then we use that for a couple of things. One is the much talked about truncation of the unsynchronized tables. And another important one is impact analysis. We have a whole bunch of utilities that we've built that look at different types of software that help you try to find the impacts. And I'll show you some of those in depth. We don't have time to look at all of them, but I'll touch on the major ideas, and I think it'll be clear. Data synchronization has to do with once you're live, or if you might have programs that are updating data that should be synchronized that don't publish the messages. We have several different flavors to make it very easy to message enable existing custom code without changing the code invasively or heavily. Makes it very simple. They also, we have utilities for when data gets out of sync. You know, if you get hundreds or even thousands or tens of thousands of EMPL IDs where their data is out of sync in some way because of, you know, lots of different reasons, these utilities are instrumental in getting it synced back up. We also have some utilities that'll help you volume test. It's kind of a poor man's volume testing solution. This is definitely something that folks could do on their own by following kind of the pattern we've taken here. Data validation. This is our newest utility. When I referred to utilities that we worked on recently, this would probably be the best example. And this has been informed by our customers that have been live, whether it's Palomar for over a year or some of the other schools that, you know, went live many months or even a year ago to some of the more recent ones. What we found is that existing data validation problems have really caused them a lot of heartache in production. So we're seeking to have a very thorough and automated way to find those before we go live. I'll talk more about that. Then the data verification engine, which helps you determine in minutes rather than you know, very quickly whether or not your data is in sync right down to the field level. So getting started. The data management component, and I'll show a screenshot of this in a second, but what we do here, and when we install the utilities, we take some steps to make sure that every single record in the PeopleSoft system, every single record of, you know, the techies understand as a rec type 0, a SQL table, is accounted for in our data management, data ownership metadata. And what that means is we know for every single SQL table after the split is done, is it going to be HR only, campus only, or both? And we also, the important part is we have the list, and we've worked through several iterations where Oracle's delivered updated lists of what can be truncated. We have all the Oracle tables when we install the utilities, and then the step that we need to take with each customer individually is to determine what to do with their custom tables. We use that to, behind the scenes, we also figure out any views that are dependent upon tables. We figure out what their post-split disposition is going to be. Do a couple of things with this. I mentioned it before. That, you know, the first thing we did with it was we create truncate scripts. We can also generate, and I'll show that, rename scripts for testing, and I'll talk about that. But really, and we didn't know this, I guess, when we first started, but the greatest value that we've gotten out of this has been with impact analysis. So here's what the component looks like. It's pretty straightforward. We group all the records into groups, and for the most part, the groups are pretty close to the object owners in campus solutions. But there's, you know, exceptions, and we've handled those with custom groups that we've created. There's 3 tabs of information that we keep track of. The first just tells you what the record is, and that's what you see here. The next tab, I'll wait for that to show up for y'all, we use for data warehouse impact analysis and update and reporting, for example. We call it reporting analysis. In some cases, there's tables that might be present on both sides, and we have to determine which one we're going to report one. We have the capability, I don't think I have time, I think actually I do have a screenshot of it. We also have a utility that will rewrite things like ETL scripts based on table ownership. Often in an extract script, you'll see database name dot table name, and the thing that has to change if you're not looking to rework your entire warehouse is just where you're pulling those tables from, or at least that's a good place to get started. And we've saved a lot of time for folks with that. The next tab is annotations. We keep track in this metadata of how each table is synchronized, if it is going to be synchronized, and this helps us drive our impact analysis. So we know, for example, that a particular table is part of the, you know, here I'm showing person disability sync or person basic sync service operation. So it's a pretty straightforward idea. The most important part of this concept is that we're keeping track of every single table. I know I've seen a lot of posts and folks talking about, you know, getting the majority of the tables, and we think it's important to make sure that you really keep track of every single table. The reason is truncating the data is nice. You know, you save space, but I think the most important reason to do it really isn't to save the space, but to make sure that you're not using it anymore. We're truncating it so that if someone accidentally does have a query on a table that's no longer in one of the databases, they won't think it's still working if there's some data in there. If you don't keep track of every table, the ones that'll be very difficult to catch in your analysis and testing tend to be things like setup tables that often don't get exercised heavily in testing, and custom tables. You got to watch out for that. So we found it important to take care of every table or track every single table in here. We have a component that generates the scripts. I'll go ahead and show you that. It can create truncate scripts. The script type there you can pull down, and it can do rename. And what it'll do is it creates a line in these scripts for every table that actually has data in it. In the beginning, we used to do all the tables. The DBAs didn't like that, so it's smart enough now to check to see if there's any data, and it'll create a truncate if that's what you're up to, or a rename. The reason you'd want to rename the tables, and I've sort of gone back and forth on this. Originally, I thought it was the world's greatest idea, and then it was a little bit harder than we had thought that the first few schools that I did it. I think we've gotten better at it, but it is something that has side effects. So if you do rename all your tables, and what my utility will do, and this is something you could script on your own, is I'll rename the tables XX underscore record name. So it'd be, the first table here is XML attributes. It'd be XX XML attributes. That's valuable in testing if you're worried that you haven't done thorough impact analysis. If you were, in theory, to go and touch everything, at some point you should see some kind of really clear blow up because that SQL object won't be there anymore. The challenge with this approach is that you can't load patches generally. Your audits will go crazy because you can have all these orphaned, you can have a whole bunch of record definitions and people tools that don't have a matching SQL table, and it's a little bit tricky. But interestingly, some customers that I'm working with very recently have lots of things like PL SQL and Java that really aren't as easy to parse and chop up through our automated analysis, so we want to do a second round and test it with a table rename, and this makes that easy to do. So the next thing is the impact analysis engine. So I talked about, the first thing I'll generally do is go in and make sure I've got every single record accounted for. I know where they're going to live. I recurse all the views and things like that. I then start talking to customers about what sort of customizations do you have. And there's the biggest thing to find, the needles in the haystack basically, are what I call read impacts, where there's some kind of data being read across the databases that's just not going to be present in a split environment in one database. So you got to do something about it. The impact analysis engine's job is to find those. It doesn't actually fix them. That's kind of down the road here, and we'll talk about that. But at least what this does is gives spreadsheets, basically, is what I give the customers with the list of the object name and the records that it accesses, or tables, if you will. And generally from that will reveal a lot. What I've found is even at large customers, there's generally a small percentage of software crosses the database, and of those that do cross, even at customers that have a huge number, it tends to be driven by a manageable number of tables, on the order of, most customers, although there's huge differences in size and complexity, a handful. It could be 6 or 8. That's not uncommon at all. Larger, really complex, multi-institution or big institutions, it can be on the order of usually less than 100, for sure less than 100 in my experience. And what we do is there's different types of technology, so we have different approaches to scanning them. Things like queries are very straightforward. In fact, that was the first thing that we did. With queries, what happens is you're going to have to update, if you want this to be clean, your query trees on both sides and your actual queries. You'll have a set of HR queries that you can be run in HR. It makes sense. And you'll have a set of records that makes sense to be in the HR query tree, and vice versa on campus solutions. What the impact, and we have scripts that'll split those, and that's easy. That's usually maybe 99% or much more than 99% of your queries will be straightforward like that in my experience. Then there's a percentage of queries that actually do cross. And we'll see those with things like financial aid, work study, analysis, or instructor pay analysis, where maybe somebody's actually looking in the paycheck table, which won't be present in campus solutions, and looking at financial aid packaging data in FA. So what we do is we have one way of running it so that it'll look at all your queries, another way to run it where it looks at files, and that generally is SQRs, but I've also done lots of PL SQL now and .NET, ASP. Let's see, we've done some Java, just anything that's in plain text, lots of warehouse type extracts from different technologies to figure out if, which of your modules, if you have hundreds, which 5 or 6 do you really need to go and review and do something about. PeopleSoft projects or People Tools features is another option, and there's a couple different ways to do that. One is you can put all your custom components and app engines in a project. This is usually what I do now, and we'll scan those to see how they cross, and that'll give us a good hint as to which features of yours need to be scrutinized. The other way to do it is if you have logical features grouped into their own individual projects, you can give the tool a list of projects and it'll recurse those projects. And what it attempts to do is if it finds something, for example, like a component, it'll see what records are on the component, what subpages, and recurse things, what people code is attached to the component and the records, and parse the people code, that sort of thing. It automatically determines your read impacts. That's what it's for. Here's what its run control looks like, and I'll lift that. Here we go. You should see it now. It's pretty straightforward. You just put a checkbox as to what type of impacts we're looking for, and we run it, and it stores the results in a header and a detail table. And the header table contains what program it parsed, and then the detail table has all the different records for that program. And the output of all these different types ends up in spreadsheets that look like the following. I think this is from queries. I obscured some of the data so that it wasn't clear, who this came from. I just grabbed one from a customer. Typically, we'll have a spreadsheet or a tab in a spreadsheet for each type of object. Not every customer has all the different types of objects, but this comes from a PeopleSoft query that you can change for your purposes. That goes against those two tables that I mentioned. So what I also often do is I'll highlight the record in red. I'll analyze this. We'll get from anywhere from tens of thousands of queries down to, for example, 20. I'll look at the 20 and I'll find that it's 6 or 3 even records that are causing all the issues. I'll highlight those for the customer and then come up with some kind of a recommendation or set of options for dealing with that. The other thing the impact analysis engine can do, I want to mention just briefly, I don't feel we have time to go into that in detail, but it can look for all sorts of upgrade type impacts. Since we were parsing code, I think I was asked by a warehouse group at a big customer, they wanted to know anywhere that I found, for example, a particular string. There was some date math that was being done on a field that changed types, and that was giving them heartache, and they didn't want to have to peck through hundreds and hundreds of scripts to find that. So I have this concept of searching for generic strings. We can also search for a particular record and field pair or column and table column pair if it's referenced together in a particular module, and that's helpful not just for the split but really for kind of general upgrade impact. So if you're cleaning up tables and you've got custom tables that are getting deleted and you want to know if you still got any code that reference them, those sorts of things we can also report on pretty easily. Alrighty. And let's see. This schema update impact tool, actually this is really more than impact analysis. This is actually updating the code. What it does, and I've used this for ETL scripts, I think that's the only place that I've used it, is often we'll see ETL scripts that, as I mentioned before, will start with a database name or an owner schema name or whatever, and we will update that on the fly based on where the table should be reported on going forward. And for tables that aren't clear, things like person, where it's going to be in both places, if you remember back on the data management component, you can specify where this tool should designate that the table comes from going forward. So it'll search for your old schema and replace it with the new schemas and rewrite those scripts to an output directory, the same name, and put them in an output directory. And that was actually a huge time saver at the place, the one place I can think of that we use this heavily. And I'm getting ready to use it again, but that's something to think of. Definitely something to avoid doing by hand. This next utility is something that I developed very recently, and it's pretty straightforward. What it basically does is for any record in the system, it will run the edits, the PeopleSoft edits against it, and any particular people code edits, things like preferred flags, for example. So it'll obviously find any prompts that are invalid, and that can be really helpful when you have orphan data. And I see that way more often than I ever thought I would. And by orphaned, I mean you might have, for example, an email address out there, but there's no person. I've seen that at places where they clean up their EMPL IDs. That particular example might not be a problem for messaging, but most of the errors we find will. That's just something that's probably a good idea to clean up. I often see, in fact, I don't think I've ever been anywhere that's had perfect preferred flags for emails and email addresses and phone numbers. So in PeopleSoft, the rule is you got to have one and only one preferred email or phone number. I see lots of systems that will provision emails from things like dormitories or third-party systems of all sorts, and it's very common for those preferred flags to get screwed up. You know, one case is that you haven't set anything to preferred. Another is that you've set more than one of these to preferred. So that was what motivated us to build this utility. And what it does is it runs against either a set of EMPL IDs or the entire population. Usually I'll run it for 10 or 20,000 just to get a sense for what I'm getting, and that'll run in a few minutes. On a database with 1 million EMPL IDs in it, this thing can take, depending on how many records you check, but it can take anywhere from a half hour to, I think I've seen it run even 90 minutes, but that might have been a few million EMPL IDs. So I generally will run it for a population, see what sort of trends I'm getting, and I'd say most customers have a few validation issues that affect often a lot of data. So if they have a problem with primary flags, it's usually pretty pervasive. If they have a few million email addresses, it's probably affecting nearly all of them. I've seen all sorts of bizarre things, and they do cause issues. Effective dates with date times in them, I've seen that cause issues with the messaging. Orphaned rows. If you have an orphaned row on the receiving system side, that can cause us sending the message being sent over to fail. But anyway, one thing that's interesting, I think I have some results here when I ran it against the demo database, the one that I did demos with from Oracle, and I get thousands of issues, although some of these are baked, but it goes to show you that there's a lot of issues. I have yet to see a customer that doesn't have this problem, so that's what really motivated us heavily to do this, and I think this will save us a lot of time. The motivation is for the split that if you have errors out there in your data, even if you find, there's two things we do with this. One is we try to figure out where that data came from. Sometimes it's from conversion, but more often than not it's from an admissions feed or a test score load or something of that nature. We try to fix the problem. The work really isn't done once you've just fixed the problem. You should clean up the existing data. If you do nothing, those messages from the application load or whatever it might be that are loading invalid data will probably fail, in general do fail, when they message across. The thing that's not so obvious is that if you have invalid data out there, and even if you fix the program that was creating it, once you touch some of the data that's been sitting and lurking, maybe even from conversion, it can cause problems in the messages flowing through. Haven't seen that as much, but it's definitely something that I've seen, so we want to look out for that. The other set of utilities, so I talked about what we do to first organize it or assign every record its ownership. Then we do our impact analysis, and once we're done with our impact analysis, we have two sets of tasks generally to complete, other than the data cleanup and things like that. But the programming type tasks include dealing with the read impacts. Those are the queries or SQRs or people tools components or whatever they might be, app engines, app packages that cross databases, that are going to basically try to read data that's no longer going to be present in the database that it's running in. We talked about that, so we have a list of all of those at this point. We've cleaned up and rooted out any source of invalid data, hopefully. The next thing we do is we fix or message. There's the two types of impacts, the read impacts and the update impacts. The read impacts are those that are crossing databases, and for those, and I talked about it in the last webinar, there's different approaches you can take, and we don't have a utility per se that does that, but the different approaches are things like database links, materialized views, and there's trade-offs with those. What we do have a utility for is the area where if you have a customization that is an update impact, which means it's updating data in one of the synchronized tables, for example, person or email or addresses or phone number. These would be admissions loads that are creating people. It could be self-service, custom self-service components that you have that update person data. In order for the data to stay synchronized, you need to publish messages. So we've come up with a number of ways to help depending on the technology and the context of the situation. If you've got I've seen lots of people tools, self-service, custom stuff, not the delivered stuff, where folks are either doing an admissions app or maybe some kind of state waiver or financial aid award updates, where person data gets updated. And in those cases, it's a people code program. It's easy to publish messages, but rather than have you format the message and figure all that out and debug that, we have an application package where you just have to call a method. You instantiate our package in your code, a couple lines of code, and then call a method, and we'll publish the messages for you. We also have a number of batch utilities that use the same publishing engine, and there's different flavors of this to solve some of the different patterns that we see out there. The first publishes from staging tables, and this follows the same methodology as the ICER, and custom SQRs are a good fit for this, and I'll talk about that. Also, we have the ability now, and this is kind of new, just the last few months, to publish from population selection, either just from population selection itself, and this might be you have some staging table that you load with addresses or something, and you want to update those and then send the messages. We could select against your staging table. We have another way of doing this also, where we can run our compare utility, find out what the differences are, and then send messages to sync things up. You can filter. I'll talk about that based on what the compare results. You don't always want to send everything that comes up in the compare, unless you're owner subscriber. Or you could always push everything from campus. So here's the first, and this is the one that we've used a huge amount, in part because there's been challenge with the enterprise components delivered, publish, and the lingering. In the beginning, it was bugs that caused us to not be able to use it, and now it's the concern around not being able to partition the person data queue by EMPL ID. The enterprise components utility reads staging tables that are populated by delivered processes that can't publish messages, things like ICER. Some of the old test loads would do that. I don't know that any of those are still in use. I see this with ICER primarily. The ICER program is a COBOL program that can create person records and update person records, and as thus it needs to be able to send messages, but because it's COBOL, it can't publish those directly. So what it does is it writes to a set of staging tables, and then the customer is to run this old enterprise components utility to publish messages. The rub is that it publishes lots and lots of EMPL IDs in one message. That's based on some configuration, but it's really built around creating as few number of messages as possible. The challenge with that is that when we're sending this stuff across, we really in general need to partition the queue that it goes through by EMPL ID, so that one EMPL ID's errors don't hold up everybody else's, and everybody gets an error or two. And what will happen is, if you have lots and lots of transactions coming through, until you resolve that single error, if you're not partitioned, it'll hold everything up. I don't I haven't seen where that would be acceptable anywhere. So the trade-off, it's pretty harsh. So what we did is we developed a utility that simply publishes messages based on the same staging tables, but publishes them more granularly, one per EMPL ID. And that's what this does. The other benefit that this has is that if you have SQRs that load, if you have custom SQRs for admissions or loads or test score loads, whatever, chances are, or at least many that I've seen have used the delivered SQCs for some of the person logic. Those will automatically populate these staging tables. So what's been a nice surprise at a number of customers that I helped is that they didn't have any change. They just had to run this program instead of the delivered EO program. They didn't have to change their SQR at all. With ICER, there's no change to ICER. You just put this in the job and it'll run. So that's the staging table in our first real heavy use message publish utility. The next, at the bottom of the screen there, you see population selection. What that allows you to do is create a PeopleSoft query or a file or anything that population selection can understand as a driver and feed it the EMPL IDs and the type of change you want, and it'll publish the messages for you. So this would be real helpful in a couple of different scenarios. One would be, and the reason I originally built it was for a school that loaded, I don't remember which type of data it was, but it was something like phone numbers or emails, or maybe even addresses or a combination from a custom staging table. And all they wanted to do is just, they had it all figured out where they update their data, and all they needed to do is publish the right messages. And what we can do with this is just run this this utility with a query, and it publishes the messages for them, and it makes it real easy to do. The other place where I've used this a lot is when, unfortunately, if data gets out of sync, and often we'll just SQL the data back into sync, but more, it's much less concern and risk if you do it through messaging. And this is a way to sync back up data if you want to. And generally, if folks get a lot of data out of sync, what I say is first, let's get all this. If you're subscriber only, there's some concern about which side the data comes from or where the ownership is. What I tell them is let's first take care of the student data. And what you can do is write a query that just checks to see if there's any job record. And I've only had that not work at one customer because everybody gets a job record at that customer, every student, regardless of whether or not they're a worker. So in general, what you can do is check, see if they have a job record, push all the campus person data for students over to HR, get that in sync, and then see what you have left. And usually it's a very low number of persons that are out of sync. So that's pretty flexible. And then there's another utility, but it's in the same vein, and the big difference is that this one runs the compare utility first to see what's out of sync, and then can publish messages from that result. And this just works for the person data. It's something we can certainly extend, but custom tables and such, it wouldn't know about that. But it does know about all the split-related messages, person and disability, and those messages. And what it'll do is it'll first run the compare, and then against that you can run a PeopleSoft query if you want to filter that. And generally, the filtering we're doing is just filtering out the students only. And then publish the appropriate messages for the changes that are detected. And this one will handle things like, if a record's been deleted or anything like that, any kind of difference. Early on, that was something that was a little bit more challenging to do. You don't want to be too confusing, but this will actually brew the correct delta message, if you will, to sync up the data from one system to another. That's it for the publish utilities. I think we've got a good utility for all the different types of challenges that we've seen and we've come up against. The next thing is, and this is something I really recommend you do. Even if you don't have our utility, you could think of a way to do this. Is do some decent performance testing, especially if you're a school that loads applicant or prospect data or test scores or anything of volume that might create lots and lots of messages. that's been one of the biggest. There's a couple of things to watch out for when you're loading lots of messages. The first is when you're actually loading the data to make sure that you're not locking up the integration broker tables. You may have a solution right now in place that's loading applications, for example, for you and working just fine. And then the change with the split might be, the only change would be that now it's going to publish messages. Regardless of how you do that, if you're publishing lots of messages in batch, be careful about how you're committing that data. If you're not commit, you might have in the past chosen to commit at some sensible, interval, like 1,000 records or something, to get peak performance. The challenge with that can be now is that if you're publishing messages and you're not committing and it's holding locks, even for a short period on the integration broker, I think it's the Q instance table. It's a table where it keeps track of the next value that's going to use for unique identifiers. You can start getting messaging errors, and I've seen this be a real challenge. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is throughput. Is that can you process those messages in an acceptable period of time? And I've found that that's been a pretty good story. The only challenge area has been schools that get surprised when they load really large batches. And that would generally be prospect loads or test scores, something like that, that's creating or updating tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people, or any kind of batch process for that matter that for whatever reason is updating a huge number of records. The first thing I always tell folks is, oh my gosh, do we really need to update all those records? And in fact, today I'm working on a routine that what it did in the past was every single day it updated every single person's address and phone number, whether or not it needed to be updated. Well, that would create a heck of a lot more messages than we need. So we're making it smarter to determine, do I need to do this update and then only send the minimal amount of message traffic. So in order to, once we figure out what our goal is, the first thing you'd want to do is, what are my peak load's going to be, and what's my goal? For example, do I want to be able to do 1,000 messages in a minute or 10,000 messages in a minute? You come up with that goal, and then with this utility, what you can do is there's a driver table for it where we put in the EMPL IDs of some of your existing data, and then choose what action we want to do. We can pretend to add that person or update that person. And we run the utility first in its setup test mode, where if you're saying you're going to add a person, for example, it'll first delete that person from the target system, which is usually HR. And then we run, you only ever do this in a test environment. Then we run the test, and it creates messages that will create the person or do the updates depending on what we put in our driver table. And I always run the verification engine, and this is one of the interesting places where I did find lots of validation issues. Everything would look good. We're testing, online. Everybody's testing everything. We got running our admissions loads, and everything's going through testing real smooth. Then we come along and we do, in the early days, we do some performance testing, and we'd find that, oh my gosh, we're getting some errors with this existing data, and it's always related to invalid existing data. So this is a place that can show some of that as well. Now we're a little bit more thorough, I think, up front about finding that, so we're not seeing it anymore. But that's something interesting, and that is a poor man's way to find some of your invalid data if anybody's interested. And if you got small enough volumes, you could even run the full sync, run everybody through the messaging, and you'd really know what kind of errors you might get or have lurking in your data. But we'll run the verification engine. The goal is to have all the data in sync after this thing runs, and we look at the timings. How long did it take? Are things queuing up? This is a system administrator activity, but it can be kind of fun. And then what's nice with this is you can rerun the exact same test over and over again. So if you didn't get the result you were looking for, you can run the setup test again, puts the data back to the state it was in before the test ran, then execute the test again. And setup test again will actually delete or reset the changes to the pre-test state. So it's doing all of the gymnastics and heavy lifting. This thing it's pretty simple. It's, something you could probably build on your own, and it was definitely worth it. I have not found, I think it was on the listserv, but I know some folks have talked about doing the full syncs like I mentioned, but the bigger customers or customers of any size, I've had a hard time with the full syncs. Remember too, those full syncs are usually multiple EMPL IDs per message, so it's not really the same kind of traffic you're going to see. but that would certainly be a way to push a lot of volume through the utility. Okay, so we're doing really good on time. I hope you guys have questions. The last utility that I was going to show you all today is the data verification engine, and this is something that you can actually get from the Oracle Community Source site. And I believe there's a link on here. You can reach out to me. There's certainly contact info for me, and you can get this thing. This one we shared with the community. Real early on. It was actually the first utility that I developed. The first thing that came to mind for me is, oh my gosh, this data is going to get out of sync, and how are we going to know? And before we can do anything about it, we really need to know. It also helps us to not let the data get out of sync by making our system testing much more accurate and effective. The goal with the data verification engine was real simple in the beginning. We wanted to know quickly, and quickly I mean minutes, and I've seen this, it's amazing, special thanks to Myron Wintock who helped me design it to run fast. It can run, I've seen it run as fast as 1 minute and 20 seconds and compare all the tables, but generally it runs kind of more in 10 to 15 minutes, and compare all the tables in a large environment, millions of EMPL IDs, all the tables that are part of the integration, and all the fields that we care about, and report the differences. It's something that I tend to run frequently and test, ad hoc when I do things like a performance test, or if I run through a test plan and I want to see, right away, did my tests work? The thing I would caution folks against, and I didn't realize how big a deal this would be, until we went through this, was that the logical thing to do, what most people do, is they'll type person in on one side, let's say Campus Solutions, and save them, add a new person, and then they'll go over into HR and look with their own eyes. And the first time you do this, you're probably going to look really close, and hopefully you're going to check all the different records that should have got populated and stuff. You might do a pretty good job. And then you might go change some data, and then you might go look. Maybe you add an email address on, to that person, and then you want to go look in HR and see if the email address shows up. And if it does, in that case, you're probably tending to focus on what you changed, just that email address. The quirky thing that I've seen, and I really didn't see this coming, was that due to the fact that the handler that supports the API for saving this data is based on a component interface over two kind of distinct sets of information, the diversity data and the person data. We've seen some really odd things when there's bugs that can be caused by invalid data. We used to see, and I think this is fixed, but if you had an invalid, I think it was gender or marital status, if you had a blank instead of unknown, which is a U, it would for some bizarre reason wipe out some of the other, some unrelated data. Things like, I've seen it wipe out, and I don't remember if this is the exact case, but I have seen it blow away diversity data, and that was the problem we wrestled with early at Palomar and got fixed. We might not have known that until we got into production if we weren't running the verification engine, because we weren't testing diversity when we found the problems with diversity. So anyway, I've found that it's really important that when you check your results, that you check all the results. Even if you've got an email provisioning system or a phone number update thing or whatever, don't just look at the records you're touching with your customization. Look at everything that gets integrated as part of the message. And like I said, you can download this utility or you could build your own. It's really, surprisingly small amount of code, but it's been super, super performant. It runs in minutes and very helpful. So I've used it a lot during system testing, and then also I recommend that folks run it in production, like on a nightly basis, and then maybe not as often when they start not getting a lot of results out of it. One of the big features of it that we're real proud of is that it's extensible. In other words, you can add your own custom records or other PeopleSoft delivered records to be checked without changing the code. You can just do that through configuration. You can also specify in that configuration which fields you want to track, and I'll show a page where you set that up. And even, I don't think I show this, but if you want to ignore certain types of formatting that might be a little bit confusing, but things like zip code and phone numbers get formatted when they go through the API. If you insert those in an SQR in an unformatted manner, you may have been doing that for years and never noticed any problems with it, but when it goes through the API, it'll show up with the formatting, things like slashes and dashes and such. Not functionally any different data, but it'll be different from a database perspective. You can choose whether or not you want to consider that different when the verification engine runs. So here's the compare record definition component. So this is for names. The names record, and that's one that, when you get the utility either from the community source or from us, that's part of the metadata, that comes with it. And then you say how you want to compare the data, and you can use a database link, or the other choice in there is that you can compare against another record, which could be a view with a database link in it, or it could be a table that gets populated. I know some of the DB2 customers, we had issues with links and things, and they actually clone or replicate the data back and then compare it, and they've been pretty happy. It's an extra step. That's a bummer, but this has helped them a lot. And then it has a couple of different records where it stores the differences. The first is a summary record, and briefly that just has the keys plus a status. Is the data different? Is it missing on one side or the other? And then a differences record that actually stores the actual data that's in the table, so that we can show it on our page, and I'll show you that. Also down here, notice that you can turn on and off. I'm pointing at the active and the little grid down here. You can turn on and off which fields you want to compare. There's a lot of fields. It found some interesting things here. The real obvious ones that you don't want to compare would be things like date times. Or things like longs. We're often not good at comparing using this method. The other is, and this one was really interesting to me, threw me for a loop the first time, is that if you upgrade HR, you'll notice that the algorithms for computing some of the name fields are different between the different releases. So you really have a hard time comparing, for example, the calculated name field. So what we'll generally do is just compare first name, last name, middle name, and assume that if those are in sync, that the system's calculating the name field as appropriate depending on the app release that you're at. Hope that made sense. It's a little bit confusing. There's a couple things on here. One is the message name, and that's just for segmenting this data, and then so that it knows how to show it to you in this review component I'm going to show you, which is dynamic. And then what field is the high-level key? What do you partition it by? And that's just for this next component. And there's the run control. We'll see it in a moment. The run control, this is a batch process, and we run the thing. I have done, pages for people that just does one person at a time, and I haven't really baked that into the utilities yet because it's always been one-off. That's easy to do. Generally, just run it as a batch. Tell me, hey, for the given message, what's out of sync, what's in sync. And after you've done that, the next thing to do is you can go to this generic review component. And the cool thing about this component is it works for any record. These are generic fields, if you will, and the labels and everything change depending on what you're comparing. And the reason that can be valuable is that if you add one of your own custom records to this, if you had a custom record that you wanted to see if it was in sync, you'd be able to review the differences in this page without changing any code. You'd have been able to set it up on that page I just showed you. You'd have to create the records to store the differences, but that's pretty straightforward, and that's really well documented. Haven't had too many questions on it, so either people aren't using it much, which is probably likely, or they're just not having that much trouble. And maybe I documented it pretty well, which would be nice. Definitely folks have gotten through that. It's not too hard to do. And you don't have to create a component that shows you the differences. And what this component will show you is for every difference it finds, it'll just show you the fields that are out of sync. So if you use a previous version of this, I used to show you all the fields, and you had to kind of stare at them to see which ones were different, and figured out that this was a better way to do that. So this page is nice, especially when you only have a handful of differences and such. And what you can do, especially if you have low volumes, is if you notice in the upper right, and those two yellow buttons are not in the one on the community source. But what these will do is figure out what sort of message should be published depending on which version of the data you want. assuming you want the data from the local database. If you're in campus, that'd be the campus solutions. You could click the sync data from local. That would push a message over to HR to sync up the data. Or you might look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is an employee. Somehow that stuff didn't come over to campus, and you could say sync data from remote, and it would tell the remote system to send you a message. And that's been pretty helpful. That's only usually doable if you've got a handful of people at a sync. If you've got much more than that at a sync, we'll often use the utilities that I showed you before, or even SQL the data back into sync, although I'm trying to do that less and less now. Not that I've had terrible issues with it, but I just don't always like SQLing things. I like to go through the APIs if I can help it. So that's the review component. So now we're at the end, and I think we're pretty good. We've got at least 9 minutes for messages, and I'll put the, if anybody's got questions, I got to go look them. I don't see any questions, so if anyone has questions, please go ahead and type them in. If you want to get the compare utility, this is instructions on how to get it, and we're going to make this slide deck available so you could download it and you'll get all these. You don't need to take notes or anything like that. There's been some pretty good blogs, and I don't know that I got them all listed here. That's the blog about the utility. There's also some good blogs I'll plug out there. One really recently published regarding navigation, and I'm not sure if it's published yet or not, but there's one coming on materialized views that I strongly suggest looking into once it is available, if it's not available already, if you plan to use DB links or views. Here's my contact information, and I still don't see any questions. So if there's no questions, I think that's it. And thank you to Carol for helping us get this set up. Did anybody have any questions today? Or Carol, am I looking at it wrong? I don't see any.
No, I don't see any either. So if no one has any questions. All right, well, if you do have any questions, you can obviously send them straight to Mike or myself, and I can get you in contact with Mike as well. Oh, I do see one that just came through. Did you see that one?
Yep, I did. And I also, okay, so the question is, oh, shoot, I just accidentally undocked the thing. Oh, my God, where did it go?
Okay.
But it was about, yeah, go ahead and read it.
How do you deal with security syncing?
That's been a bigger, okay, so I'm guessing what you mean is user profile security and roles and things like that. And that's depended a little bit by institution. One of the things to point out is that in order for the data to replicate, you don't need to have the operators who are changing the data in both databases. That used to be the case in older tools releases and people saw this a lot in the CRM integration, and I know I go places where they have CRM. They're often really concerned about, oh my gosh, how are we going to keep the security square so that when we send the messages they don't fail in the receiving system due to lack of privileges. For example, a student who changes their phone number in self-service won't have access to change phone numbers in HR, so it's logical that might not work. To make that a lot easier, and this has been a godsend, frankly, and I found out about it right when we were doing Palomar. So I think it must have been in Tools 8.5.1 or 5.0. I'm pretty sure it's relatively new. There's the ability to bypass the PeopleSoft token, or I forget the term for it, but if you look at the configuration component for Integration Broker, the last tab, exclude PSOP token, you stick the messages in there that you're replicating data with, and that means that you don't need to have all the users in both databases. Now, having said that, I'd say more often than not, I've been in the business of syncing users, generally administrative users, not students, into HR, but even Palomar did this where we would filter the user profile message, and we use Integration Broker to synchronize user profiles to HR back and forth between HR and campus, but only for users that were of a certain type, not the students. I've had schools that have synced everything, and that can be it can be a challenge. One of the challenges that you got to keep in mind, and I've been kind of wrestling this ironically quite a bit the last few weeks, is that the user profile queue, some customers have problems if they partition it by operator ID with locking the the version table, and that can be really nasty. It's weird because I've had really big customers not have this problem, and then just this week I have one that's not so big and is having this problem. So that's probably been one of the more challenging aspects of the split, although this is, all of the capabilities for syncing user profiles and security roles and things like that have existed prior to the split, and for the most part there's folks that are familiar with it who've had CRM or the Enterprise Portal or ELM or sometimes even financials, and they've set up single sign-on. That's been kind of my experience. I hope that answered it, Kim. I do see the questions now. I found them. If it doesn't, feel free to shoot me an email, and I'll do my best to help answer your question better.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. So, like I said, if you do have any other questions, just get a hold of myself or Mike, and we can definitely get you an answer with that. The HUG would like to thank Cedar Crestone for putting on today's webinar. Again, this recording and the slides will be available tomorrow on HUG Online. Please take a few moments to review the upcoming webinar schedule, and we'd like to thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.